Just a decade ago, countries like Spain, France, and the United States dominated tennis. Fast forward to today, and the landscape has shifted dramatically, and a new powerhouse has entered the picture. With 9 players in the top 100, multiple in the top 30, and Jannik Sinner claiming the world #1 spot, Italy's rise in tennis has been impossible to ignore. This surge brings up a question. How did Italy go from a tennis middleweight to a producer of world-class talent? Is this just a coincidence, or is it the result of a carefully orchestrated strategy by the Italians? Now, I know someone out there might be saying, hold on Noah, isn't tennis an individual sport? Doesn't a player's success come down to their own talent and hard work, regardless of where they're from? Well, you have a point. The triumphs of Federer and Wawrinka didn't necessarily lead to Swiss dominance, and Andy Murray's Wimbledon titles didn't exactly spark a tennis revolution in the UK. The United States, despite its historical supremacy in the sport, hasn't produced a Grand Slam champ in 21 years. And even Novak Djokovic, the greatest player of all time, hasn't exactly propelled Serbia to the forefront of tennis either. But dismissing national tennis programs makes you fall into the trap of framing bias, which is zooming in on individual success stories while losing sight of the broader system at work. The truth is that the Italian Tennis Federation has done something super special that we could all learn a thing or two from. Here's how they did it. The Italian Tennis and Paddle Federation, or FITP, has some important names that have been instrumental to its tennis powerhouse status. Starting from the base in the coaching department, we have Michelangelo Deladera, who's the head of high performance for Italian tennis and the mastermind behind everything. He was the one responsible for unifying the Coach Education Institute and the Player Development Department. By investing in coach education while creating a closed circuit for player development, Michelangelo was able to establish a forward system that was more process-oriented than one that settled for quick fixes. But hold up, we're just getting started, and I'm about to blow your mind. This guy designed a training plan for tennis coaches based on approximately 5,000 hours of education training. Yeah, you heard that right, 5,000 hours. But he didn't stop there. Supported by the Federal Council, they then moved on to create a 360-degree monitoring network of the entire youth sector starting from the 10 and under category, with promotional projects for the sport in mind. By developing promotional projects for tennis and other racket sports, such as rackets in the classroom in schools, and by combining them with tennis schools recognized by the FITP, the Italian system was able to create a bubble aimed at taking the tennis culture in the country to a whole new level. These programs ensure that tennis remains an integral part of a kid's life, which makes it a lot easier to take the sport more seriously as they get older. As of 2023, the project had almost 200,000 children throughout Italy, so you can be sure that the number is even more today. The systems in place in the country weren't just aimed at training alone, though. They were hubs for cultural exchange and community engagement. And with these programs already in place, Italy didn't forget about private coaches. You see, Italy also has diverse and challenging environments that foster player development. The country has about 136 provincial aggregation centers directed by as many FITP provincial coaches. On top of that, there are 16 peripheral training centers intended to support the best kids in the country from ages 11 to 16 years old. The role of the Italian Tennis Federation, through the FITP national coaches and consultants, is to support the private coaches of the individual athletes, providing them with everything needed: technical, organizational, medical, and psychological assistance. They do this by organizing technical meetings, trainings, evaluation tests, and most importantly, helping out with whatever economic contributions are needed. In a way, the Italian Federation decentralized its training structure by supporting elite juniors wherever they lived, and allowing them to stick with the coaches they'd chosen themselves. Now you might be asking yourself, how do these all hold up? Imagine you're a private coach and you have a talented student, but you both just happen to lack financial and economic support. In 99% of cases, the dream simply dies and one party abandons the other. It's usually what happens sometimes in some countries or places with limited resources. But with the support Italy gave and is still giving their private coaches, the implication is that they could now continue to follow their best students without having to abandon them in adolescence at some point. Having this continuous player-coach relationship allows for consistent guidance and mentorship that's critical for long-term development. But perhaps the most important thing is simply seeing how these measures have increased the competence of Italian coaches in recent years. Having dealt with tennis at the grassroots, the next step was that transition phase to high-level tennis. The Italian Federation has 18 and under and 18 and over sectors to help top athletes who are looking to take that giant scary leap into professional tennis. The goal of these sectors doesn't change. It's all about encouraging continued growth and, more precisely, supporting professional figures with the most competent hands. Essentially, you could grow up in a different place in the country, work with a different coach, play a different type of game, and still be successful. Let's take Sinner, for example. He's from South Tyrol on the Austrian border and only moved to the Piatti Tennis Center when he was 12. What about Musetti? He's from Carrara. The much older Berrettini is from Rome. And the whereabouts in Italy is Lorenzo Sonego from? Well, Sonego was born in Turin. Knowing that you had a good chance at being successful in tennis wherever you found yourself in the country was a big win in itself. By contrast, in the US, for example, many tennis players have to move to Florida or California to further their careers. In Italy, you might not need to move as much, and even when you need to move, it doesn't take too much out of you and your family because Italy is a much smaller country geographically. The fifth factor may be the most important one: SuckerPunch. Obviously, I'm kidding, but if I was an up-and-coming player or even a casual player, this is a product I would want on my side to help me play my best tennis. Most of us aren't focusing on hydration as much as we should, especially on court. SuckerPunch keeps me fueled through my training sessions and helps me get the most out of my body. Each hydration shooter is packed with electrolytes, magnesium, potassium, and calcium, key nutrients that maximize muscle performance and prevent cramps. Try a pack and get 25% off your order by using the code Courtside-Punch at checkout. I'll leave the link for you in the description down below. And be sure to let me know how it works for you. Another factor that facilitated the growth of Italian tennis was the importance they placed on research. In my research, I came across tons of papers like this, where Michelangelo Deladera, Luigi Bertino, and many others focused on maximizing training programs for coaches and students alike. For instance, in this paper, we see a focus being placed on junior doubles. These guys are well aware of the fact that doubles in juniors is something that's often overlooked in training programs of tennis coaches literally around the world. So what did they do? At the end of the study, they came to the conclusion that changing both the size of the court, thus taking off the alleys, and changing a server's position, bringing them to serve inside the court, would force players to naturally execute attack patterns such as the serve and volley. That's just one of many papers, remember. But Italy's federal summer centers have essentially become sort of laboratories for testing out these proposals based on scientific research. Essentially, here's an infographic showing the success of the Italian system in the last few years. Another important factor responsible for the resurgence of tennis in Italy has been the organization of major events like the ATP Finals in Turin, ATP Next Gen Finals in Milan, and the Davis Cup Qualies in Bologna. Don't forget that they also already have one of the most prestigious Masters 1000 tournaments, the Italian Open in Rome. On a more micro level, Italy has been funding and organizing more and more ITF tournaments and ATP Challengers and Futures events in different cities too. Italy is probably the country that hosts the largest number of Challenger tournaments at this point. The smaller tournaments allow the federation to give Italian players more opportunities to gain experience. They also allow young talents to also play quality opponents close to their homes without having to incur a lot of extra travel and accommodation costs. The bigger tournaments attract more casual fans, bring more credibility to the country's tennis culture, and bring in more revenue too. A couple months ago, Sinner was asked about the reasons behind Italy's success, and he perfectly summarized some of the points we've just talked about. Here, take a listen.
You know, in Italy we have so many tournaments, you know, starting with juniors and then in the future and challengers, and we have big ATP tournaments there, and we have good facilities and then great coaches, you know, and I think the combination with that and also the weather, I feel like, you know, we can play the whole year outside if we want. It's I think this is one of the reasons.
With more tournaments organized in Italy than ever before, the Italian Tennis Federation has leveraged its control over wildcards to provide more opportunities for players and help them climb up the rankings faster. Italy's national technical director and former top 25 player Filippo Volandri has explained that in the last 8 years alone, the nation has used wildcards more than ever as an experience accelerator. Current world number 679 Federico Sina is a 17-year-old Sicilian who benefited a lot from wildcards and Italy's new training setup. Federico reached a career-high number 4 in juniors and has occasionally been a training partner for top players like Alcaraz and Rublev. He's definitely someone to keep an eye on in the coming years. Sina has talked about how privileged he was to be able to train at home rather than transfer to a national center, also stating how the FITP offered support for all aspects of his game. Sina mentioned that not only did the Italian Federation help him out financially, but they also gave him a mental coach to help out in key moments during matches. I imagine that there are many players across the globe as good as Federico Sina, but without any of these resources. Speaking of resources, there's probably an underlying contributor to Italian tennis that we need to point out. The Super Tennis TV in Italy has had a significant role in boosting interest with free-to-air live and delayed match broadcasts. The channel was created in November 2008 with the aim of promoting the sport in the country, and indeed, the nation has seen attendance figures in the country skyrocket since then. Super Tennis holds rights to some WTA 125 events, ATP Challengers, and a couple of other tournaments, including the Davis Cup and Next Gen ATP Finals. There's no doubt that the channel has made the sport more accessible to a wider audience, which invariably enriches the already existing culture and inspires the next generation of players too. Last year, Super Tennis TV secured rights to air the US Open in Italy. Sky Italia broadcasted the US Open and will also do so next year as part of a two-way sub-licensing agreement with Super Tennis. Watching tennis in some countries is already difficult enough, and even though you pay a lot of money for subscriptions, they still don't cover every match. This is an intrinsic problem in tennis that the Italian Tennis Federation has managed to deal with to some extent. Of course, the free-to-air television network doesn't show all the matches, but I bet it's a lot better than what some other countries have to offer. Next up, we have Italy's professional tennis registry. If you didn't already know, the PTR has been instrumental in shaping the coaching landscape around the world. With about 1,400 active members, PTR Italy has facilitated knowledge exchange through certification workshops, refresher courses, and international symposiums. Almost a half a dozen of these symposiums are held in Rome during the Italian Open, which are also aimed at popularizing the sport and galvanizing public interest. They've been publishing a lot of books, giving out handouts, and overall, the publications from Italian authors have been on the rise. The collaboration between PTR Italy and the FITP means that Italian coaches are always at the forefront of contemporary practices, which contribute to the overall success of Italian tennis. But let's be honest. Generally speaking, as an athlete, for you to be successful in a given sport, your country has to care, at least to some extent. And yes, I know there are exceptions. But in general, your chances of being successful in tennis are much higher when your country invests in the sport. In Italy's case, there's been a developing tennis culture over the years. I know football, or soccer to us Americans, takes the center stage, with the Serie A being one of the most prominent leagues worldwide, and teams like Juventus, Milan, Inter, Napoli, and others having millions of fans. The Azzurri dominated the 90s and early 2000s, but there's always been room for tennis, and that room has gotten bigger in recent years. Especially since Italy is no longer dominating football like in the past, when there was no topping the likes of Maldini, Francesco Totti, Cannavaro, and Buffon. Looking at the sports pages of national newspapers these days, you'll notice more attention has been placed on tennis. Now, why is this important? More popularity generally translates to more people picking up the sport, which leads to a larger talent pool and higher chances of producing top-quality talent down the line. This positive feedback loop is something the Italian Tennis Federation has managed to harness in the last decade. In essence, the success of Italian tennis is deeply rooted in the country's culture and a meticulously cultivated environment. From being around since the 19th century to gaining prominence in the 20th century and now dominating other countries, it's been quite a journey. The Italian Tennis Federation was founded in 1930, and the Foro Italico Sports Complex in Rome and the Italian National Training Center in Tirrenia popped up years after. Italian players were previously known for being good on red clay courts more than any other surface. Players developed their games on clay, learning to construct points with endless rallies. It was mostly a slow-paced style of play, but it worked, didn't it? Italian tennis legend Adriano Panatta won the French Open title in 1976, even beating the legendary Bjorn Borg twice at Roland Garros. Francesca Schiavone then made history in 2010 by becoming the first Italian woman to win a Grand Slam singles title at the French Open. Sara Errani then reached the final at Roland Garros 2 years after. The Italian women's team won 4 Fed Cup championships between 2006 and 2013, some of which were played on clay. Marco Cecchinato then became the first Italian man in 4 decades to reach the semis at Roland Garros in 2018, and a year after, Fabio Fognini seized the title in Monte Carlo in 2019, beating 3-time defending champion Nadal en route to the title. I should mention that Fognini is only one of 4 players to have beaten Nadal 3 times on clay. The point being, the Italians have always been known for their strength on clay, but there's been a bit of a shift in this clay culture, and we're now seeing a lot more of these Italian players who actually have pretty well-rounded games across all surfaces. This didn't exactly happen out of the blue either. In 2009, the leadership of Italy's tennis federation launched a fast court project because really, if Italy was going to produce players who were going to the top of the rankings, they needed to excel on all surfaces. Before the early 2000s, about 90% of the tennis courts in Italy were clay, but what followed entering into the 2010s was a fast court construction boom where both outdoor and indoor hard courts were created, and some grass courts added in too. Today, there are more than 3,000 hard courts throughout Italy, which is more than 4 times as many available compared to a decade earlier. Safe to say, now we know what's up. We've got an Italian sweeping the hardcourt majors in 2024. Italy's Davis Cup captain Filippo Volandri, who was a clay court specialist himself back in the day, mentioned that to thrive on hard courts, players needed a different training physically, psychologically, technically, and tactically. In his words, quote, "We're trying to change the identity of our players. We're training for modern tennis. That's why we have players who don't seem Italian in terms of their technical style." Volandri captained the Italian men's Davis Cup team to the title last year, which was the country's first title in almost half a century. The final rounds of the knockout stage were played on hard courts, with Sinner beating Djokovic twice in one day, first in singles and then as part of a doubles team, before beating him again at the Australian Open and most recently in the final in Shanghai. This season alone, Sinner has won 6 hard court titles if my math is correct. Wait a second, let me count. The Australian Open, Rotterdam, Miami, Cincinnati, US Open, and Shanghai. Okay, yeah, we're good. But Sinner aside, look at the quality we now have on both tours. There's Musetti, who's one of the craftiest players out there, and is on his way to doing great things. Matteo Arnaldi, who's already a top 30 player. Flavio Cobolli, known for causing crazy upsets. Luciano Darderi, who snubbed Argentina and also won the Cordoba Open earlier this year. Luca Nardi, who is one of the most talented next-gen players and beat Novak earlier this year at Indian Wells, and a couple of other guys. Just look at this generation of Italians born between 2001 and 2003. Oh, and don't forget, we still have the older guys, Lorenzo Sonego with the forehand rifle, and 2021 Wimbledon finalist Berrettini, who was one of the first Italian players to develop a game suited for fast courts. I should also mention that many of the younger Italian players had one another to compete against from an early age. Being members of the same sort of cohort, they pushed one another to become better. Another factor we shouldn't overlook is the success of women's players in Italy in the 2010s. After Schiavone, we had Flavia Pennetta winning the US Open in 2015, beating another Italian, Roberta Vinci, in the final. In fact, when Schiavone won the French Open in 2010, no Italian man was ranked inside the top 50, and only 3 were inside the top 100. It's safe to say that the women's performances in the 2010s also inspired the men to become better. Currently, there are 4 Italian women in the top 100. Jasmine Paolini, Elisabetta Cocciaretto, Lucia Bronzetti, and Sara Errani. At this point, Jasmine Paolini probably needs an entire video dedicated to her, especially given her insane season and the challenges she's had to overcome at a relatively older age. But back to the topic. Okay, so you remember we already talked about Michelangelo Deladera and his role in bringing Italian tennis into the limelight. We also need to talk about the president of the federation, Angelo Binaghi. Perhaps seen as controversial by some, Binaghi was instrumental in many of the reforms we talked about. Since his appointment in 2001, he's focused on bringing more economic and political power to the country's tennis in any way possible. In his words, quote, "Italians are interested in the results, not the ways in which they were obtained. I was voted on by promising that Italy would never again be humiliated by France and Spain," end quote. However, Binaghi's aggressive repression of anyone who tried to oppose him probably didn't sit too well with some people. Another important name that needs to be mentioned is Andrea Gaudenzi, who became the ATP chairman in January 2020. Gaudenzi presided over changes in funding models, and there's no denying that his appointment has been a positive thing for Italian tennis. The season-ending ATP Finals was moved to Turin in 2021 after a decade in London, and the move brought more attention to tennis in the country. Sinner's ATP final match against Novak drew in about 6.7 million viewers in Italy, which was a national record for a tennis broadcast. Overall, Gaudenzi's position as the ATP president has been a beacon of light for the country. Renowned tennis coach and strategist Craig O'Shaughnessy has also given some insider information about what goes on behind the scenes in Italy. O'Shaughnessy has been working with the Italian Tennis Federation since 2016, and he says that the federation has been open-minded and forward-thinking in their approach to developing young talent. O'Shaughnessy, who focuses on data-driven analytics to formulate strategies against opponents, said that the federation was keen on using every resource to create an organized system of high-performance coaches, camps, and tournaments. And according to the man, there was camaraderie among everyone. No jealousy, no egos, no bad vibes. O'Shaughnessy also mentioned that Italy did something that very few national bodies would do, which is looking outside of its own ecosystem to find the best people in the world in various specialties. The federation worked with a number of consultants with respect to fitness, technique, strategy, and tactics, and it paid off big time. So much so that in 2022, Italy bagged the overall performance trophy for the first time since 1998 at the Tennis Europe Awards. They would then retain the title the following year and also win 3 out of 6 awards. Also, the number of registered club players in Italy has jumped from around 129,000 in 2001 to 820,000 in 2023, making tennis the second most popular participation sport in the country, only after soccer. Getting that number to 1 million registered players is the immediate plan of the FITP, with the facilities, coaching centers, and tournaments already popping up in every nook and cranny. It's only a matter of time before they reach that milestone. So what are some of the biggest lessons to learn from the Italian Tennis Federation? Well, first of all, a generation of talent can't be 100% planned. What you can do, though, is to put systems in place to increase the odds of putting the very best talent on the map. For the first time in the nation's history, an Italian is sitting pretty at the top of the ranking, and Sinner's reign at the top is the result of a process that started literally 2 decades ago. And with coaches like Piatti, Vagnozzi, Pistolesi, Sartori, and Santopadre, and other elite coaches, you can be sure that the best is yet to come. But we should also remember that the Federation has had to navigate some difficulties with players in the past. And the FITP has been previously criticized for how they handled certain players. Andrea Seppi wasn't given a wild card and the chance to play in front of his home crowd before retiring, and something similar almost played out with Francesca Schiavone. Ludmila Samsonova also wanted to represent Italy, having grown up in the country, but the word on the street was that the bureaucratic complications made it difficult for her to get an Italian passport, and she ended up representing Russia. However, looking past whatever flaws might exist, you'll find a dynamic system upheld by a new number of people willing to put in the work despite any limitations. That's really the secret formula. But then again, eras come and go in tennis. Swedish tennis was the king in the 70s and 80s, with Borg, Wilander, and Edberg doing the most. Other nations have ruled the more recent decades. Right now, Italy is right there at the top, and other countries are taking notes and studying the model on how they can do better. I don't know how long the cycle is going to last, but in the coming years, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw another country picking up from where Italy left off. But over to you guys. What do you make of Italy's young tennis talents, and how far do you see them going? Be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter if you're looking for the latest coverage from around the WTA and ATP tours. And if you've tried the SuckerPunch hydration shooters or pickles, let me know what you think. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep going for the lines.